I'm Rob Bell, an engineer with a thirst for understanding how things work. Join me on a journey to investigate the incredible structures that have stood the test of time and their ground during what was to become a global war. "1940, following the fall of France and the devastating defeat at Dunkirk, Britain stood alone against the onslaught of the unstoppable Nazi menace. With her back against walls not yet built, construction began on an epic project, transforming this green and pleasant land into an impregnable island fortress.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender."
Churchill's rousing speech of defiance laid out the plan for Britain's defence. Each week, I'll be exploring the streets, hills, and landscape he spoke of to uncover the monumental, mysterious, and heroic buildings that helped us win the war. Today, nearly 80 years later, thousands of seemingly random structures still litter our countryside. In many cases, they're just blocks of concrete you might see during a daily commute or pass by on a weekend walk. But if you know what you're looking at, behind these remnants of bricks and mortar, there's a much darker story to be told. It's a tale of terror and fear. At a time when fascism overran the rest of Europe, Britain stood alone. Today, often all that's left to remind us of those dark days are these crumbling remains. But in their day, they were the buildings that fought Hitler. By 1944, with America and Russia now fighting at our side, the outcome of the war was no longer in any real doubt. The threat of invasion had long receded, and it was now our turn to attempt to regain a foothold in France. The invasion of the French coast would be the largest and most complex amphibious operation in history. And an undertaking like that leaves many echoes in the landscape, if you know where to look.
In the early summer of 1944, Britain basically became like a huge military camp. You'd have maybe 3 million GIs that were based here. You had the British troops that were ready to embark. Leave was cancelled as D-Day became imminent. And eventually we have this massive movement of troops across to the Normandy beaches.
The campaign to invade France was named Operation Overlord. D-Day was the code word for the actual day the invasion would take place. We take it for granted now that Operation Overlord was a success, but that was by no means a given. Like so many aspects of the war, Allied success was down to hard work, detailed planning, and a fair slice of luck. Much of that planning took place in this building, Southwark House. It was the headquarters of Admiral Ramsay, commander of the naval part of the operation. General Eisenhower, the overall commander, also spent much of his time here. Situated just 6 miles from Portsmouth, Southwark House was close to one of the main D-Day embarkation points. Having been requisitioned by the Navy in 1941 to be used as offices for staff bombed out of Portsmouth, it was the natural choice to be the advanced planning base for Operation Overlord.
This is the map room. This is where Admiral Ramsay and his staff coordinated the Operation Neptune, which is the naval phase of Overlord, to get the Allied troops onto the beaches of Normandy. So this was Admiral Ramsay's headquarters, and he came here in April 1944. So the map was already up. It was made by the Light brothers from Wimbledon, who had made models for the Royal Navy in the lead up to the Normandy invasions. And there's some pretty key features on it I'd like to show you. In the right-hand side is obviously the quay, and a number of Wrens, female naval personnel, would be on a ladder, and they would pin on here all the ships and the symbols to show the progress to the senior staff, Eisenhower included, Montgomery, who would come and look at the progress of the operation. The first act of D-Day by Ramsay was on January the 1st, when he ordered 2 British minefields, one off Cherbourg and then one off Le Havre, to try and bottle in German surface vessels so they couldn't get out into the channel. The red are the routes that would be used by the troops as they embarked and then travelled into an area just southeast of the Isle of Wight, Z or Zulu, which was the assembly area. They rapidly called it Piccadilly Circus because of its busyness.
I think the thing that just gets me is just the sheer scale of the entire operation. You know, when you're talking about nearly 7,000 vessels involved, you're talking about kind of over 4,200 landing craft. Every single one of those vessels, every single one of those landing craft has got to have men allocated. An individual has to be allocated to that. The logistics of it, of getting all those troops from different ports all along the south coast of England into the right ship, into the right landing craft, and arriving at pretty much the right place on the right time on D-Day itself is something that just absolutely makes your brain hurt.
One of the dangers highlighted by the chart is mines. Both sides had laid extensive minefields during the war, and now they posed a major obstacle to the invasion.
These grey areas on the map, you see this hatched one going up to the Calais. That's a German minefield that extends all the way up to Norway. It's non-magnetic, but it still has to be cleared and transited by a vast fleet of Allied ships. And you'll see then lanes coming down through the German minefield, which have been cleared by Anglo-American mine clearance and clearing routes down to the beaches.
And there were huge minefields off the coast of Normandy, of the coast of all of France. And paths had to be, passageways had to be created through those minefields, through which the warships and all those landing craft could pass. And that had to happen, that clearing had to happen literally just ahead of the main invasion force. And it was the biggest single anti-mining operation of the entire war. In fact, of the history of the world ever happened on D-Day night. And it is absolutely remarkable that they achieved it without any problems whatsoever. One of the reasons why it's never mentioned in the narrative is because it went so well. And people always want a bit of hardship and they want a bit of kind of, you know, in the narrative, in the story, you want to have a little bit of things going wrong, a bit of human drama. But the point is, it went so well that they've actually kind of written themselves out of the story.
The sea lanes through the minefields end at the D-Day beaches. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword.
Now, there's an interesting story about Juno. Churchill, who took very personal, close interest in the allocation of code words, that was originally called Jelly. And he said, how can you send men to die on a beach named Jelly? So they renamed it Juno. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. Now, in order to deceive the enemy, because we wanted to convince them that we were going to land somewhere else, so we had a less hard fight on the beaches, there was a deception plan that overlaid Overlord. The big deception plan was strategic, involving Patton and the 1st United States American Group and another British army in the north of England that didn't exist, but the Germans thought it was, targeting Pas de Calais. But on the day, there was a tactical deception plan as well, and this is shown on the map. You'll see Big Drum there, you'll see Taxable and Glimmer. And these are operations involving naval and air forces to deceive the enemy. One involved the dam busters in specially adapted Lancasters that dropped a window, tinfoil, out of their cockpit that would replicate the movement on the ground, on the sea, of a naval force approaching the coast elsewhere. And this obviously kept the Germans' attention elsewhere, so that, of course, the landings at Normandy were a strategic surprise.
With the Armada gathered along the south coast, in one requisitioned building, a group of elite men held their breath. No one could be 100% sure what awaited them on the other side of the channel, but it turns out they knew a little bit more than you might imagine. It's hard to overstate the level of planning that had gone into the preparations for D-Day. Detailed work for Operation Overlord started after the Tehran Conference in 1943, where Churchill and Roosevelt promised Stalin that they'd open a Western Front in 1944. Since then, no part of the invasion had been left to chance, which led to the creation of a surprising structure in a wood in Surrey.
Since first occupying France, the Germans had constructed a fearsome set of defences along the French coast, known as the Atlantic Wall. Far more elaborate than anything the British had built in 1940. This is a recreation of part of that defensive wall.
This wall was built in 1943 by Canadian troops as a way of testing methods of getting through the concrete. The purpose of this wall really wasn't to practice big attacks with hundreds of troops all trying to get over. It's more about having an engineering problem. How do you get through thick concrete, and it's got steel reinforcing inside it to make it even stronger?
All types of weapons were fired into the wall to assess how much damage, if any, they would do to a structure like this.
There's a couple of holes in the concrete here. In fact, the whole face of the wall is just full of holes and damage, exposing the steel reinforcing rods. It shows even a fairly powerful gun fired against this concrete. There's a little bit of damage, but it's barely anything at all. So this wall was built to be tested on and basically to be destroyed. And so we're standing in a hole that was made by one of those tests. As you see, it was reasonably successful because it made quite a big hole. What the Canadians were testing right at this spot was a piece of equipment called a double onion. So this was a frame that was fitted on the front of a tank, and it had explosive charges set at different points on the frame. And the idea was the tank would approach the defence, drop this frame next to it, retire a distance with trailing a wire behind it, and then when it was at safe distance, set the explosives off. And because they were on this frame, they were dispersed around the surface of the wall rather than just being at one point, and then they could cause more damage. And you can see the results it's had.
Testing on this wall proved the double onion tank could do the job, but it would require driving right up to the face of the wall under enemy fire. So a less dangerous solution was developed.
On D-Day itself, they didn't use the double onion, so they used a type of Churchill tank called Churchill Avery, which stood for Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers. So this was a standard Churchill tank that was modified to have, rather than the usual anti-tank gun, to have a very large petard mortar that couldn't fire very far, but could fire a really massive charge. Those sort of tanks, when faced with an obstacle like this, would fire a series of these charges against it. One wouldn't do this kind of damage, probably, but they'd have to fire a series of shells at it, and gradually that would batter the wall down. One other tool that they developed by the time of D-Day was Churchill tanks that were bridge layers. So they were carrying a bridge that could be laid up against an obstacle, and then other tanks could drive over that bridge and off to wherever they needed to go.
Nowadays, we can easily build a detailed picture of anywhere on Earth using satellite imagery. But back in 1944, it was far harder to understand what awaited the Allied forces once they reached the Normandy coast. The planners needed to understand what the terrain was like and what the exits from the beaches were. To solve the problem, they came up with some innovative solutions.
One of the quite bizarre methods they used was they put an appeal out on the BBC saying, did anyone have postcards or photographs from holidays in Europe? Amazingly, 10 million were sent in. Presumably a lot of them were no help at all, but some of them showed things like beaches or a bridge just inland. And with lots of other sources, the Allies put these together and were able to make use of them to gather information about potential landing sites. Another important source of information on the German defences, on what the real Atlantic Wall was like, was the French resistance and French people, some of whom had actually been forced to work on building the German Atlantic Wall.
Ordinary French civilians were taking amazing risks to help the Allies, acts that could easily have cost them their lives.
There's even a case where a Frenchman who was a decorator was called into a German headquarters. There were plans of the Atlantic Wall lying there on the table that he managed to smuggle out, and that managed to get back to the UK for the Allied intelligence. So there was a wide range of sources to try and figure out what was in the German defences in the real Atlantic War that the Allies were going to face on D-Day.
Und sofort wieder Tarnung. Munition. Ein Geschütz fährt in seinen Bunker ein.
This wall on Hankley Common is just one small example of the vast amount of effort the Allies went to whilst planning for D-Day. As engineers worked out how to overcome the beach defences, the troops who had breached the Atlantic Wall were camped across southern England. Equipment needed to be gathered and the assault troops trained in total secrecy.
Southern England becomes basically a military camp. It's a kind of a park for tanks, for armoured personnel carriers. It's got sort of things taking landing barges on the back of them. You've got gliders parked up. You've got planes parked up. You've got just boat upon boat upon boat, all the way along the south coast, places like Portsmouth and so on. And so the whole place is just dedicated to war. I mean, don't forget, D-Day is going to be and still remains the largest amphibious operation ever carried out. I hope to think it'll never happen again, something that size, but it is just awesomely large. You've got 3 million men you're dealing with for starters.
This influx of men and machinery would require buildings to house them and space to train for the ordeal to come. For some villages in the south of England, the war would demand a major sacrifice.
I'm stood here by one of the doors to the church in the village of Tyneham, and you can see behind me a photograph of one of the villagers pinning a note to the door of the church. The note says, and I'll read it to you, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us have lived for generations to help win the war to keep men free. We will return one day and thank you for treating the village kindly." But they never have.
Tyneham was a village in Dorset, and just before Christmas 1943 was requisitioned by the state and used as firing range for troops preparing to invade the Normandy beaches. The villagers that left, about 200 of them, thought that it was just a temporary removal. Actually, the villagers never returned to their community because the government put in a compulsory purchase order.
Tyneham was owned by the Bond family. All the residents were their tenants. The Bonds were eventually paid £30,000 for the land, while the residents themselves were moved into alternative homes in the surrounding area. Reportedly, the only compensation they received for leaving Tyneham was for the vegetables they'd planted in the gardens of their tied cottages.
Big sacrifices were made during the Second World War to civilians in so many different ways. And we tend to just think of bombing and the Blitz and people being blown out of their houses and stuff. But there were also these requisitions of entire communities, which I think is remarkable and which is sort of, to a large extent being forgotten.
Tyneham became the United States Army Tyneham combat training area. But the American infantry would have needed to come and use their 50 caliber machine guns, their bazookas, their anti-tank weapons, all the kit that an infantry division had to fight, and also practice landing on the beaches. And of course, not far from here, we have Studland. In April, the King and Winston Churchill came down to watch the Americans landing on Studland Beach. And also at the beach behind us, they would come ashore at Warbarrow Bay and practice landing and coming ashore and actually getting their vehicles off the beach. And of course, the infantry would need to keep themselves fit. There are plenty of hills around here in Dorset, and also their attached tank battalions as well. They had 2 allocated to the 1st Infantry Division for D-Day. They have been practicing on the tank battle runs, which still exist over the other side of Whiteways Hill and also at Lulworth itself. this place would have been a hive of activity. There would really, in truth, have been no place for a village in the middle of that training area because it would have been very dangerous.
The American troops who trained here were to play a pivotal role in the invasion to come, and they'd have left from Portland and Weymouth, which is easy to see from the beach at Tyneham.
I think there was probably in excess of 800 vessels moored in Weymouth Harbour. Well, they landed on what many know as Bloody Omaha, the 3-mile stretch of beach between Colville and Verville, which proved to be the toughest beach of all on D-Day, and casualty estimates are some 3,000 were killed and as many as 8,000 casualties. But in summary, Tyneham Valley was the hub of all that training for the 1st Division, and the divisional commander, Clarence Hubner, would have come down here many, many times to see his men putting those finishing touches together to their training before embarking on their assault craft to go to Omaha Beach.
When the war ended, the villagers hoped they'd be allowed to return to Tyneham. But as the Cold War loomed, the need for a large tank training area remained. And as the years rolled by, Tyneham was slowly reclaimed by nature. It became known as the village that died for England.
It did fall into disrepair, but then in the 1970s, there was quite a lot of money spent on renovating those bits of Tyneham that they could. And so Tyneham, from that time, has been open to the public. The houses have become ruins. That's really what it is. The MOD had to spend some money because there was a huge amount of pressure from the local community to actually get this restored.
As for the villagers themselves, they had one final chance to return to their birthplace. If they'd lived here before the evacuation, they were allowed to return to be buried.
So we're stood in the churchyard, which is part of the Diocese of Salisbury and is maintained for the diocese by the army. And this was the last man to be buried. His name is Arthur Henry John Grant, and he lived in a farm up in, not in the village, but up the valley. And the last person that we know of who has a claim to be buried in this churchyard was Dorothy Dot Grant, who was also born in a farm up the Tyneham Valley.
Tyneham has a strange and beguiling atmosphere. The buildings feel trapped in time, and walking through the long-abandoned homes, it's hard not to feel poignant about what the villagers lost. Now it stands as a symbol of a vanished past, a testimony of what we had to sacrifice during the long, dark years of the war.
"4 years after Dunkirk, and the Allies were poised to head back to France. The equipment was gathered and the obstacles analysed and mapped. The men in the assault waves were primed and ready to go. Now, one man had to give the order. As June 1944 arrived, the commander of the invasion was faced with an awesome decision. Operation Overlord had to launch now, or wait another month for the right moon and tides. But could the bow be kept drawn for that long? Would the secrecy hold? And would there be another better chance than now? The decision whether or not to go rested on one man's shoulders.
That man charged with when to launch the invasion was General Eisenhower. And he made the decision in this building, the naval headquarters in Southwark House, near Portsmouth.
This is the actual room where General Eisenhower made the decision first to postpone and then launch D-Day. And his decision was based purely on the conditions of the weather. Weather was key. The challenge for us was that the American meteorologists and the British meteorologists couldn't agree on the forecasting. And it took one individual, a Scot called Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, to actually make the decision himself based upon conflicting information about what the weather was going to do. D-Day had been originally planned for the 5th of June, but it had been postponed due to a poor weather forecast that Stagg had given Eisenhower. So Eisenhower convened a meeting in this very room to make the decision about whether to go or not. If he didn't go in this window of good weather that was forecast, D-Day would be postponed a second time into July and perhaps into August.
On whose shoulders rests the fate of the world.
Right up until the beginning of June, the weather had just been glorious. And the end of May was one of the hottest on record. You know, everyone was just sort of sweating, and it was shirt sleeve order all round. But suddenly the weather turns and it starts to build up, and suddenly the warnings from his chief meteorological team start coming in, sort of going, you know, I have a bit of an issue on our hands. Because although you've got loads and loads of weather stations all over Britain, there's not that many weather stations out in the Atlantic. So there's an awful lot of guesswork going on. And what it looks like is there's going to be this absolute mother of all storms on the kind of 4th, 5th, which is when D-Day is supposed to happen. It's supposed to happen on the 5th of June. Stagg is advised by his British team that there is this little bit of high pressure which is developing out into the Atlantic, which might be the window they need on the 6th of June rather than the 5th of June. And ultimately, he advises Eisenhower to postpone for 24 hours. And Eisenhower has to take this really big decision. He has to put his faith in this meteorological team. And he goes, OK, we'll go on the 6th. It's a massive, massive call. And as it turns out, when you can now look at those charts as they were coming in at the time, and a modern meteorologist would look at that and say to you, Stagg got very, very lucky.
The weather certainly hasn't always been as good as we would have liked, but the landings have gone on.
So here is a map of the weather on the 6th of June, a very busy chart. But here is something of more significance. This is a memorandum that James Stagg sent to General Eisenhower on the 21st of June that tells him that had he postponed a second time and the invasion had been launched in July, the operation would have failed. In fact, you couldn't land or fly anything or land troops or take troops off the beaches for about 2 weeks. So had they gone then, D-Day would have failed. And what is amazing about this memo, which really brings the hairs on the back of my neck up, if you look at the top right-hand corner, is a handwritten note that says, Stagg, thanks. I thank the gods of war we went when we did. D.E. And I think that might just be Dwight Eisenhower.
The die was cast. Once launched, the invasion would either succeed or fail. There was very little that Eisenhower could do to affect the outcome. His fate, along with that of all the Allies, now rested with the young men of the assault wave poised along the south coast. But it wasn't the men in the landing craft who would strike the first blow. That task would fall to the airborne troops, now gathered in a field in Dorset.
For victory as the first planes get away. Tow ropes are carefully guided.
The very first act of D-Day was an audacious attack on 2 bridges at the right-hand end of the invasion beaches. And that operation was launched from an airfield at Tarrant Rushton in Dorset.
Away from their bases in England safely. A job without precedent in military annals.
When you look at that building over there, you're looking at a barn full of tractors and farm machinery, but actually that's not a barn at all. That's a wartime hangar built in 1942, specifically to run glider operations from here, this airfield at Tarrant Rushton. And it's amazing to me to think all these years later that here is this incredible piece of history right there, just standing there, kind of almost forgotten about, but such great events took place from here back in 1944, because it was from here at about 4 minutes to 11 p.m. on the 5th of June that the glider troops D-Company took off from here at Tarrant Rushton for D-Day. And they were the very, very first troops at around 16 minutes past midnight on the 6th of June to land in enemy-occupied France for the start of D-Day.
Next, the glider troops. The pilot releases the tow rope and the sailplane zooms to a landing. With the precision that comes from long planning, the invasion goes forward on schedule.
Well, it's all full of tractors and old coaches and farm machinery now, but back in the day, back in 1944, this would have been teeming with the tug aircraft. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you can see the doors. These would have been the original sliding doors. There's been concrete put across now so that they won't move. But, you know, you can imagine what they would have been like back in 1944. The troops that were used, that were going to be the first to land in Normandy, were D Company, the Ox and Bucks. They weren't actually paratroopers. And the reason D Company was chosen was because in pre-invasion training exercises, they had proved the most adept. But although they didn't know exactly where they were going to be landing until right at the last minute, they did know they were going to be attacking a bridge. And when they did land, at about 16 minutes past midnight on June the 6th, 1944, every man knew exactly what he had to do.
6 gliders were detailed to attack 2 bridges. The aim of the attack was to capture them and hold them until the troops landing on the beaches could come and reinforce them. The British could then get troops onto the high ground beyond the bridges, which would stop the Germans threatening the flank of the invasion. If the Germans had managed to do that, they would have rolled their tanks along the beaches as the Allies came ashore. The stakes could not have been higher.
So this was a really, really vital operation. And it was amazing because they landed so brilliantly. All 3 of the gliders that were due to land at Pegasus Bridge landed exactly where they were supposed to do. They immediately got out of their glider, charged across the bridge. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, who was in the advance, he was shot by a German in the neck and bled to death soon after. So he was the first Allied casualty on D-Day. But they did manage to A, secure the bridge, and B, take off the demolition charges that had been laid by the Germans underneath it.
Within 8 hours, 4,000 prisoners were rounded up, and every objective was seized, a flying step to victory.
With the invasion fleet underway, thousands of men aboard ships and landing craft headed out across the English Channel. Destination, the Normandy beaches. Often seasick and terrified, these men were about to take part in the greatest amphibious assault the world has ever seen. And there were so many unanswered questions. Could they reach the glider troops at Pegasus Bridge in time? Would they be able to overcome the fearsome Atlantic Wall? And would what had been one of their greatest defences, the weather, shine on them? The next 24 hours would change the course of history. From ports and quaysides along the south of England, an entire army, along with its ammunition and supplies, needed shipping out to France. A challenge in itself. But getting there was only half the problem. Besides the bombs and the bullets, for those planning the operation, the big worry was how to get such a vast number of men and machines ashore, and then immediately operational when no ports or harbours were under Allied control. Once again, the Allies came up with a structural solution.
Large ships needed sufficient depth of water to be able to offload their cargo. So the decision was taken to construct a temporary port off the Normandy beaches. So these Mulberry harbours were towed about 400 different sections across the channel and then constructed outside of Gold and Omaha beaches.
The purpose of Mulberry harbours is effectively you're making a vast kind of breakwater and port. You know, just cobbling it together and floating on top of the water. You know, it's a very kind of Heath Robinson kind of British, quirky, kind of random type of invention, but it really works.
In the waters off Castletown on the Isle of Portland, you can still see 2 of the giant components of these harbours. They sit next to a pier that was used by troops heading over to Normandy. The site is now owned by local businessman Derek Luckhurst, who's created a museum to commemorate the part Castletown played in D-Day.
The Mulberry harbours are probably one of the greatest military engineering feats of all time. After the failed Dieppe raid in 1942, it was clear that if we were going to invade any port in Europe, it was essential that we took our own port with us, because understandably, the first things the Germans did was to blow up all the ports. So the concept was to create 2 enormous artificial ports and tow them in 400 component parts across the channel at 4 knots, that's nearly 5 miles per hour, commencing a couple of days after the D-Day landings.
I think the Mulberry Harbours are one of the most extraordinary engineering feats ever undertaken. The scale of them is 2 harbours the size of Dover, which is one of Britain's major ports, that were entirely floatable and then dragged across, towed across the channel and put into place. When this was first put forward, I mean, it was just sort of laughed out of house. And then Churchill said, you know, I know there's going to be lots of problems, but don't argue about the problems. They'll sort themselves out. Just get on with it. Just do it. And so they did.
The Germans never imagined the Allies would do something as audacious as this. In fact, one of the reasons they thought an invasion in Normandy was unlikely was the lack of available port facilities. Each Mulberry Harbour was made up of 148 blocks called caissons, an engineering term meaning a box. These hollow concrete caissons were floated over to Normandy and then flooded to allow them to settle on the seabed. A flexible roadway on a floating pier linked the harbour to the beach.
The idea was to create 2 Mulberry Harbours. Mulberry A, which was the American harbour, and that was established off Omaha Beach. And then there was Mulberry B, which was the British and the Canadian harbour, which was established off Sword Beach, just off Arromanches. And in fact, the 2 caissons behind me came back from Arromanches in 1947. The British brought 10 of them back, and subsequently 8 of those were given to the Dutch government. There was an enormous storm in 1953 which breached their dikes, and we towed 8 of them over and put them in the holes to stop Holland continuing to flood. So they actually continued to serve a purpose well after the war.
The caissons are a constant reminder of one of the most audacious parts of the British contribution to Operation Overlord. But it's not the only role Castletown played in the story of the invasion.
Castletown was significantly impacted in the Second World War. Not only was it the target of 46 air raids from the outbreak of war to the end of the war, but in late 1943, Americans started arriving in the vicinity. And Americans were bivouacked all around the area, Weymouth, Swanage, Bournemouth, Poole, etc. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of GIs were waiting, ready to go. And the activity in Castletown was enormous because, of course, they were creating the embarkation points for all these vehicles and all the troops that were going to leave from the pier just here and the hard standing just 50 yards further down the road.
In less than 3 weeks from D-Day, the Allies had not only secured their western bridgehead into Europe, they were also in the process of taking one of the finest deep-water harbours that Europe has to offer. In fact, the Americans were in Cherbourg.
The buildings that remain from that time are all around us. In fact, very little has changed in Castletown since the 1800s. The pier that we're sitting on at this moment has been around for a couple of 100 years, and despite the fact that it now has modern structures on it, it served basically as an embarkation point, and it was surrounded by larger ships, landing craft tank and landing and various other landing craft. So there would have been hundreds of thousands of troops walking up and down this pier and on the hard standing next door. 7 pubs, apparently 3 fish and chip shops, a tailor's, 3 grocers, a butcher, and they must have done a roaring trade. It would have been terribly exciting to be here at that time. 2 years ago, it was my privilege to interview an old lady who was recounting her experiences as a young wren. She was walking through Castletown and a big black sedan drove by and slowed down. And she looked in, and in it were the King, Winston Churchill, and Eisenhower. And she remarks, I looked and my jaw dropped and they all looked at me. And she said, I wasn't in proper uniform, I was working, and I didn't have a hat on, but I shouldn't have saluted. But I couldn't let my monarch go by without a salute, so I snapped to attention. And do you know what they did? They laughed. That's a lovely story. And she said, and a week later, on the 4th of June, I was in Castletown and in the naval base. And it was incredibly busy with all the excitement and the tension. And we knew that the invasion was imminent, but of course it was top secret and we didn't know when. And she said, on the 6th of June, I went to work and there was nothing. They'd all gone.
As you'll see, this American landing was anything but unopposed. If not one of the first landings, it was early on. Beaches had been seized, but pockets of resistance remained to be mopped up.
Most of us will have seen that amazing film, Saving Private Ryan. Now, the opening sequence of that film, where the American 1st Division, as they were leaving the landing craft and running up the beach under a hail of enemy fire. Every single one of those chaps, whether they lived or died, left from Castletown on the 5th of June 1944. In a sense, that's what's inspired me to create the D-Day Museum and to put these statues on the Phoenix caissons behind me. Between June 1944 and May 1945, at the end of the war, Castletown was the embarkation point for 144,000 vehicles and 420,000 troops. Absolutely amazing when you think that this single road and this little village here was to see that volume of military traffic in so short a period of time.
With the Allies back on French soil, the stage was set for one of the final acts of the war. Some of the most savage fighting was yet to come. The Germans would battle on till the bitter end. Their fanatical Nazi leaders determined that the country would go down in flames rather than surrender. But for now, the war had moved on from Britain's shores. And over the next 80 years, the buildings that fought Hitler would gradually fade from view. But if you know where to look, the echoes are still out there.